Welcome back to Resilient Foundations, where we talk about leadership that holds steady when the pressure spikes. I'm Rebecca, and today we're going to talk about solving real problems and not just addressing symptoms. It's an uncomfortable truth that leaders can be very good at solving problems, but they may actually be solving symptoms. Leaders are often decisive, they're thoughtful, they're caring. They can be excellent problem solvers in moments. But if we're really honest, we might look at it and say, well, often we might be chasing symptoms and solving at the higher level instead of really taking the time to dig deep and look at the root cause of what's driving the problems. Let me give you an example. When I was working with a company I was responsible for some of the contact types that were coming in the call center. And we needed to get our contact volume down because it's expensive to have calls coming into the 800 number, emails, but you have to staff people to respond to all of those contacts. And a contact is a symptom. Something is not working in your ecosystem if people or your customers have to reach in to get support. So what did we do? We had a brainstorming meeting. One of the suggestions right off the bat on the table was, well, we could just shut off the 800 number. Sure, that could reduce the contacts very quickly because now you only have one way for the customers to come to you, which is a ticket from the online portal. However, that would have been a terrible customer experience. We put it on the list because there are no bad ideas in brainstorming, but what we really shifted to was, well, let's look at the root cause. What data do we have that can tell us why people are actually contacting us? And when we dug a few layers below surface, what we found out was there were products, some in particular, that were causing the most volume. And then what about those products? Well, there actually were some product problems that we looked at and said, well, the product's actually not working quite correctly. And so we submitted those as fixes to the product team. Can we get these resolved to drive down our contacts? Some of it was documentation. And some of it was just the onboarding process for the customers, like they were coming in as new customers and we hadn't onboarded them very well as a company. So there were multiple areas, but you go after the 80-20 rule and we were able to drive down contacts significantly just by going to that root cause and understanding what's the real driver versus just saying, reduce the way that they can get a hold of us. So in problem solving, it's all about problem definition. And if you do that right, what you get to is a problem statement at a deep enough level that you're going to prevent things from recurring. So leaders, again, they're usually great problem solvers. We don't always take the time to get down to the layer where the change is actually going to have the biggest impact. Why does that happen? Well, even capable leaders. So leaders are often under pressure. And when you're in pressure, your thinking processes actually collapse, especially when it's an urgent situation. When you have a fire, what do? You reach for the fire extinguisher. You're focused on just stopping the immediate problem. But often what happens is we solve that immediate problem, we put the fire out, we stop the bleeding, but we don't go back and then revisit why did that fire start in the first place. So what we want to do is make sure we don't just address the immediate problem, we actually go back to the source and look for why it happened in the beginning, and then we can prevent that in the future. The other thing is organizations tend to reward speed over accuracy. It sounds good on a status report to say you did something. So a fast answer actually can look in the organization like you're providing leadership. Versus careful diagnosis can look like analysis paralysis and hesitation. Yes, you have to walk that optic. You absolutely do as a leader. Being able to explain why that additional time to do proper diagnosis will save the company money, save people's time in the long run. Go in with a clear plan to do that as quickly as possible. Usually you can have leaders that buy into that above you will say, that's a great idea. Take the additional time because we don't want to have to revisit this again in the future. Speed without clarity actually can lock in bad solutions faster. So being able to get that additional time and take it to do the right analysis can save you, your teams, and the company time and money in the long run. And people are really trained to present symptoms. So the third thing is most people look for symptoms. They aren't trained to look for root causes. And because, again, we're not rewarding the pause instead of the immediate fix, you may hear things like people are resistant, communication is broken, we need more accountability, the project trackers are wrong, things like that. You'll see the symptoms. You'll see the contacts are too high. True statement. Contacts were too high. But why were they too high? You have to start asking that why question and dig down a few layers on the why. Why? 5 whys is a good approach. But we don't really train our leaders to do this. We don't really train our teams to do this. So I always suggest taking that additional beat, do the additional labor and diagnosis. Yes, you don't want to spend too long. You don't want to go into analysis paralysis. But solving at the symptom level, you're going to revisit that same thing over and over again, which will be very frustrating for everyone involved. So instead of always rewarding confidence and decisiveness and answers, reward diligence in the diagnosis. The symptom trap also feels very actionable. I can pick up the fire extinguisher and put out the fire. I can put a Band-Aid on the cut. So we might have things like a missed deadline. Well, the common response might be tighten the timeline, do more reporting. And really what the root cause of that might be, work has to have 5 approvals, and the people who are doing the approvals don't actually agree on what the success criteria is. One project that I worked on to try and reduce the cycle time or the speed at which we were able to get product out to market was an engineering project where we wanted to say reduce development time. In that, the easy answer was there's too many steps, like there's a change management approval, for example, to be able to push code into production. And a lot of developers looked at that because that was the last thing, the last step they saw before they could push their code. But when you talk to all the people in the process, you talk to the stakeholders, the teams running infrastructure, the people who had to support production, when you looked end to end at the entire chain from when development started, when the inception of the product idea, and you trailed that all the way through to that piece of code being pushed, I in particular, I mapped out every single step that was required to do that. And what we found out was there were 30 different teams individually requiring separate tickets and approvals. So even though the engineers didn't see every step in that process, the project managers and the product managers were seeing most of that. But it was hidden to the engineers who were being asked, how do you speed up your code process? Well, the engineers didn't know. That's what was actually delaying the project, was all of these tickets and approvals. And they were all very disjointed. So another way that you can get to what's the real problem, map the process. Sit and talk to all the people that have a step in that process and just write them down. It doesn't take probably more than 4 hours to get a group of people in a room, even at a very complicated process, and map it all out. Once you see it visually, it's very eye-opening. This particular process map, I threw onto a projector and I put it up on, it took an entire wall. So when people looked at that, even at the leadership level, looked at that afterwards, they're like, why do we have all of these approvals? Because teams actually do need to track their work. We're requiring them to track their work, and they're doing that through tickets. And none of the process between the tickets is connected. So we have to have better ways to connect everything between all of the teams that are supporting the engineering process. And that was where we made most of the change. And in many cases, you could say, do you even need this ticket? And there were cases where the ticket wasn't needed. It was maybe for an audit or compliance purpose. But what we did instead was we wrapped all of that into one single ticket, instead of them being individual tickets by each team that had to look at it. So it made that process much faster. And the other advantage to that was it was transparent. You could clearly see all the steps in that flow of the ticket, a single ticket. You could see where it was bogged down and what they had to do to actually get that unstuck and unblocked. So we significantly reduced. Yes, there were changes to how we managed our code environments and source code and pushing the actual configurations and build. Yeah, we made changes to that too, but a lot of it was process. Just get some of these tickets out of the way and let people move faster. So Symptom was the very last change ticket in the engineering environments that people were pointing to. But really the long pole in the tent, as I would say, is that series of tickets that was one after another, after another, after another, and all of the wait time in those tickets. We also put in SLAs so that service level agreements were held with the teams, and we could also say your tickets should not take more than XYZ time, and made that process very transparent to the end user, which was an engineer or a product manager or a project manager. So again, mapping processes, great way to identify what's really happening and where is it symptoms versus where am I actually going to solve to reduce or do whatever I need to do. So let's look at a framework you can use. Those are two different tools. You could do 5 whys, root cause analysis, process mapping, 2 really good, easy tools. But you can also just go through a set of filters. So filter 1 might be, who feels the pain? Where is the pain felt first? The people closest to the work are where the pain is felt. It's usually not the people looking at the dashboard. It's where the people are in the process working. So again, when we mapped out the process, I had everybody at the table that actually had a step in that process. It was a pretty large group of people, unfortunately, but we had to get that down to see every step and why people were doing that step. Another filter is there a behavior that makes sense if it's not a people problem? In other words, your team is rational. They are rational people. But if they're smart people, maybe we're doing something in the culture. Maybe we're rewarding certain things that are making them operate to a less desirable state. So always look at what is the reason why people are taking the actions or exhibiting the behavior that they're exhibiting, because we should assume first it's not a people problem. More often it's a process problem, it's a technology or underlying ecosystem problem. It's often not the people. It is the systems that we put the people in that are causing the problems. Another filter is what hasn't changed despite multiple fixes. Let's go back to the contacts problem. The problem of contacts had been going on for a couple of years. Every quarter we were visiting, here's the metrics on contacts, and it was before I was the leader even of the team, but every quarter they were revisiting why are the contacts so high. But no one had actually done the root cause analysis to say these are the very specific things that are going to drive 80% of the improvement. Go to the Pareto principle of 80-20. 80% of your improvement can probably be achieved by 20% of the root cause. So if you can do that and do enough diligence on the analysis, you can usually get a much bigger movement, what I call a step function change into your process and into your metric. Another filter is where are you asking for accountability, but you're not providing authority. This gets at empowerment. We're saying you're accountable to meet XYZ metric, as an example. However, you have no authority to actually, for example, get rid of tickets that are causing you to be slow to get your code out the door. So the gap between authority and accountability often shows up in speed issues. It often shows up in culture issues because you have disagreements and conflict. It often shows up in your actual friction in the process. So looking at a process from who is responsible, make sure you have a clear decision maker, a clear, what we call approver, and then who is responsible as a single owner to drive. And the more you can get that down to single accountable individuals, the faster you will move, the less overhead you'll have in tension between teams. It just makes everything much smoother. And the last filter 5, what decision could you make that would remove future problems? And it's usually when you get down to that root cause that you're talking about the right one that will remove the problem at a step function level, at a much bigger level. If your solution is fixing today and maybe not tomorrow, you're really not deep enough. So always be looking at, am I deep enough to understand and diagnose what's really happening? I'm not just looking at the symptom. The leader in this process is really just to shift from solving problems to asking better questions. It's not to have answers faster necessarily, but it is your job to ask better questions and to slow the team down. So you have to be the one to give permission as a leader. Team, we need to take the time to diagnose this properly and then help them identify the tools that will get them there faster. You may have to interrupt meetings. You may be in a meeting and hear people jumping straight to solution, jumping straight to solving symptoms. You have to be the one in the room that says, well, what if that is actually just a symptom? Have we actually looked at the data to see maybe there's a deeper root cause that we should be solving instead of just assuming that's the solution? Teams love to solve, just like leaders love to solve. So we want to make sure we're asking that additional question of, are we there yet? Are we really at the root cause? Maybe it's refusing to act on labels. For example, if someone says, well, it's just that other team is resistant to change, or they don't take ownership. Whenever you hear that, maybe that's really saying they don't have authority and we're asking them to take accountability. It could be they don't really understand what the problem is we're solving, or they don't see their part in solving the problem. And it might just be they don't really feel engaged in the process. Sometimes that's where lack of ownership or resistance shows up. I worked in another project to try and reduce how we were communicating around crisis level incidents. And again, it was very disjointed teams. Many teams in a big crisis are needed. And you will usually have technology teams, customer facing teams, executives, communications teams, legal teams. You'll have a whole variety of teams that are involved when you get to big incidents or crises. And what tends to happen is everyone is communicating to their leader what they think the status is. Natural behavior, because your leader's coming to you going, where are we with X, Y, and Z? But if you are disjointed in that, then leaders are getting different messages, and then there's confusion the higher up it goes. It's that old telephone tree type of conversation. So one of the things that we did was we sat everyone around in a room, and we actually took 2 scenario-based crises, and we walked everybody in the room through, okay, we're going through this process. What are you doing? What are you doing? What are you doing? And before we went into that room, I had people literally yelling at me saying, things are fine. I don't understand why we're spending any time on this. This is a ridiculous waste of time. I said, just play with the process here. It's half a day. We're going to sit in a room and we're just going to talk to each other. And we're going to go through this process. We're going to walk the process together. And my most resistant person, who was in my face, was saying to me, this doesn't work. And he was the person most adamant. Everything's working just fine. I don't know why we're doing this. And after he really sat around a table and heard everybody else's point of view, he was the first one to jump into, oh, we got to fix this. So sometimes resistance is really just not clearly understanding other points of view in the process. And that communication is super important to get everyone around a table and really seeing perspective. You also have to create safety to tell the truth. It is, if things are breaking, people don't want to take the blame. You don't want to shame. You don't want to blame. You really just want to get at, let's talk about let's talk about the process that broke here. Let's talk about the technology issues we might have here. Let's talk about the cultural issues that we might have here. Where do we not have the right level of authority? And try to steer it away from the naming and shaming of individuals or teams. The more you can do that, the more open people will feel and safe they will feel to actually talk about root causes. And if you start to see, like, you're actually getting to that, what is the problem? I'm defining the problem. You're going to have people expressing, I really understand what's happening. Like the gentleman who was in the room going, oh, now that I see what's happening to other people, I can agree that this needs to be fixed, because he got clarity. He got clarity on what was happening in the other teams, to the other teams, and to our customers. Energy comes back because suddenly people are working on the same problem. The boat is getting rowed in the same direction. You don't have people churning the oars in opposite directions. Your execution starts to move. You get momentum because now we can move the same direction. And then you get out of the pointing fingers, what I call posturing. You don't have so much people pointing fingers at each other, and you're moving as a collective team. You're moving as a goal-oriented process. This isn't easy stuff necessarily. And again, you have to be the one as the leader to stop, ask the questions, and ask the team to really take that next level of deep dive. Make sure you're getting to that root cause, not addressing the symptoms. So let me ask this question and I'll leave you here. If you have an issue and it shows up again, you've solved it, and it shows up again in 6 months, what will you wish you had fixed today? What will you wish you had done to orient the team to go deeper, to go to that next level? What would you have done to manage leadership expectations to give you that time and allow the team to really do what they needed to do? And if you get to an answer, this has happened to me before, but if you get to an answer that says, this is really what the root cause is and how we have to solve it, and your higher level leadership doesn't buy in, then you just lay down the risk and say, okay, I agree we may not have time or money to solve this today. Let's just understand in 6 months we might have this problem again, because we're not solving the root cause. We're solving the symptom we can solve today within the budget or the time that we have. We're going to probably have to revisit this in 6 months. Not that we want to. However, set expectations. We don't think we're solving the root cause by doing this particular solution today. So leaders, again, you're not in a firefighting mode whenever you can help it, because we're going to start improving the environment in which we're working through root cause analysis, really good problem definition, and not solving symptoms anymore. So if you solve the right problem, everything downstream gets easier, faster, lighter. Thanks for joining me today. Please like, share, and subscribe, and I hope to see you again soon on Resilient Foundations.